Relic were on a roll with Dawn of War and Winter Assault, with both games receiving critical acclaim and selling well. This was a golden age for the developers and they weren't stopping. The next expansion for Dawn of War, Dark Crusade, came out a year after Winter Assault in 2006, along with it only being a month after Relic's debut of another critically acclaimed franchise, Company of Heroes. After this, Relic went to focus on the Company of Heroes series and to work on their game engine, giving it major upgrades. So the third expansion, Soulstorm, was passed off to a development team known as Iron Law, who released the game in 2008, a year and a half after Dark Crusade. Both games when they originally released were standalone expansions, so you didn't need the prior games to run them. The only caveat was you still needed the CD keys of the other games to play the old factions in skirmish and multiplayer. So in order to play the Orcs, you needed the CD key for the base game, although none of this applies to the Definitive Edition since it's all in one collection. And yes, like my last reviews, which if you haven't seen, watch them first, I'll be playing these through DE, along with giving my final thoughts on this release. Both expansions bring two new races each. Dark Crusade comes with the Necrons, an ancient race of zombie robots that wants to eradicate all life, returning from the finale of Winter Assault. The Necrons have changed a bit in their lore since Dark Crusade's release. Again, I'm no Warhammer expert, but I do know that they're more like the Warhammer Fantasy Tomb Kings rather than mindless death machines. Next we have the Tau Empire, a fairly new race to Warhammer 40k at the time, and very different to the others, coming with a more typical sci-fi look with some Eastern influences, rather than the more darker, grittier Western aesthetic. Soulstorm comes with the Sisters of Battle, the female counterparts to the spacemarines with their own unique flair. Basically super nuns in space that burns everything that even looks heretical, although some pretty awesome designs throughout their roster, much more than a lazy Rule 63. We also have the Dark Eldar, an alternate version of the regular with a more evil and twisted take, compared to the Eldar's more elegant and refined design. I thought for the longest time that, oh, they're just Eldar but evil. Yeah, I've seen some of the lore about these guys and they are way worse than just that. So let's get into the campaigns. Both go in a very different direction compared to the prior games. Let's start with Dark Crusade. Here, there's one campaign that's playable with all races, 7 in this entry, and I mainly played it on normal. I'll get into the difficulty more in a bit. Dark Crusade takes place on the planet Cronus, a Tau colony that was once under the control of the Imperium before being abandoned. However, unbeknownst to the Tau, this is also a Necron tomb world, and this ancient evil starts to stir, prompting the arrival of the Eldar led by Farseer Teldir, who are also being pursued by the Imperial Guard for the events on Lawn 5, which seems to confirm the Eldar ending in Winter Assault to be canon. This is also where the series continuity starts getting a bit messy. The Blood Ravens decide to show up now of all time to search for chapter artifacts, because of course they fucking are, with the Chaos Space Marines showing up to take advantage of all the bloodshed, along with finally the Orcs being led by the one and only Gorgos, who got off Lawn 5 somehow, joining the fray for a good old scrap. And in case you're wondering, no, the Space Marines and Imperial Guard are not allies, they are also trying to kill each other for a bullshit reason. It would have been better if there was just a single Imperial faction that could be switched out for one or the other. Oh well. Rather than the more traditional mission-based structure of a campaign, with a developing narrative, unique objective, and each level offering a different challenge to overcome, Dark Crusade comes with a non-linear sandbox campaign, with you using a world map to pick your mission, which takes you into a skirmish battle, with the objective of destroying the enemy's HQ. I'm not the biggest fan of this, at least in comparison to what we had in the prior games. Yeah, I know, Dark Crusade is a lot of people's favourite entry, and even I played the shit out of it back in the day, but returning to this, I really find it a big step back. Here's the thing for me, if I want to play skirmish, I'd go play skirmish. I have way more options and variety there. I like a traditional campaign because it's a focused experience, giving me something I can't get from a skirmish game. But here, you get dumped into a 1v1 or 1v2 skirmish game, with the objective of destroying your enemy's HQ, and that's most of your campaign. Now there is a bit more going on, with the mechanics on the world map affecting the skirmish battles. First we have your commander unit that can be customised with war gear you collect as you play through the campaign, basically an upgrade system that you can pick and choose what you want. We also have Honor Guard, elite versions of existing units that you can recruit to join you at the start of a mission, and they don't take up any population cap, so there's no reason not to take them. Now I'm sure the developers envisioned these massive fights with your commander and the personal honor guard leading a huge army, but the reality is, once you've got enough honor guard, you can start to quickly rush the enemy and get the skirmishes over and done with in just a few minutes. There is one interesting mechanic throughout, which is persistent bases. Basically, whatever structures you built in the mission will still be there if that territory gets attacked later. So there is a noticeable difference between attacking a territory with your army and defending one of your own, along with you not needing to repeatedly keep building a base every time you're on the defensive. Now, not every mission is a generic skirmish match. There are some unique territories that give you a special buff on the campaign map, and come with unique objectives within the mission, such as giving you a massive force to go wild and destroy all the enemy structures, or giving you the task of generating a certain amount of power to win. They are welcome breaks in the monotony. Other than that, we have Stronghold missions. Strongholds are the headquarters of a faction and your way of eliminating them from the world map. Once you take all the strongholds, you win the campaign. These missions are more like the ones you see in prior games, with their own objectives and structure, and are often fairly difficult, so building up your honor guard and commander's war gear is important. Unfortunately, the quality of these missions are more akin to base game, rather than Winter Assault's highest standard, although they do accommodate the other 6 races you could possibly play as. They are the highlight of the game, and I wish I could just play these missions back to back, rather than slogging through skirmishes between them. Another highlight for the Stronghold missions is the dialogue, as each matchup of races have their own unique interactions between their commanders. It brings out the characters and little tidbits of the races, something that is lacking throughout the campaign as it's only really present in the intro. It's a shame that so much work went into the dialogue here. The developers accounted for every race versus every other race with great writing, but unless you plan on completing the campaign with every faction, most players won't experience more than a few of these interactions.
Death has arrived. We come for you. Death? You look more like a human who needs some feeding, metal boy.
The Necrons are here. Drive them back to their tombs, men.
It is your men who go to their tombs, Governor.
Do the deaths of your soldiers mean so little to you? Are you that mad?
Do the deaths of yours mean so much to you, alien? Are you that weak?
Holy shit, I think that may have been a bit too based. So we spoke about the missions, let's talk about the world map. It's no Total War, I'll say that. Each race has their own army, stronghold and territory, and everyone has their own turn where they can attack with their army, along with the ability to reinforce their territory with units that will spawn at the start of a mission. Each territory has a strength value. A higher strength value means a tougher mission, which comes in the form of the enemy having starter units and multiple AI to face at once. Honor guard and reinforcing cost requisition, and you get more requisition based on the amount of territories you have, but it's almost a non-mechanic. There's no economy system where you can spend resources on buildings to produce more, or anything else to handle like population or growth. In fact, it's very rare to ever be tight on requisition. As long as you don't piss it away on pointlessly reinforcing territory that would never get attacked, you can pretty much buy whatever you want whenever you want. And that pretty much does it for the world map. There's no settlement building, faction customization or diplomacy. The only thing that really sticks out are the unique territories giving you a buff on the map, but that's it. It's a very basic campaign which isn't inherently bad, but getting hit with skirmish game after skirmish game just isn't very appealing to me. It's a slog, and the difficulty options don't really spice things up much. The difficulty here is still odd, but at least normal is actually normal, sort of. Normal is just what you'd expect, except your units get 200% health, which sounds like a huge advantage, but keep in mind, you'll usually be facing 2 AIs at once and the strongholds are balanced around this. The big problem here is the early game being a cakewalk, since you only go up against one enemy. Hard mode is good early game but starts to become tedious mid to late, with encounters becoming overwhelming onslaughts and bullshit early game rushes by the AI, or maybe it's just a skill issue on my part. Easy mode is baffling. Your units have 250% health, which really isn't needed when the enemy units only have 25%. What? Easy mode is trivial. You can have guardsmen gunning down Necrons and spacemarines in a complete role reversal. I get it's for skill challenge players such as game journalists, but this is too easy. You're barely playing the game at this point. So overall, I really feel mixed with the direction they took with the campaign. I subjectively think it's worse, as the sandbox nature isn't as interesting to me compared to the more narrative structure, and objectively it's repetitive with its missions and is lacking many mechanics on the world map. It's not bad by any means, but I really want to see a continuation of what they were doing in Winter Assault, especially since they did a great job and could have built up even further from there. It also feels like a missed opportunity not to have a traditional campaign for the two new factions, the Tau being a, then, new race of the Warhammer universe, and the Necrons being a mysterious race with a long history in the lore. Both these factions feel right for a narrative campaign centered around them and introducing them to the audience. It's a shame that they only effectively got a footnote for their stories. Now maybe this was a decision they had to make, sacrificing the narrative campaign to instead get two factions instead of one, and if that's the case, maybe it was worth it. Since after being a campaign, it's not very often you go back and play it again for a while. Reality is you go into skirmish and multiplayer. So with that in mind, they probably made the right call in the long run by having two races over the traditional campaign route. Speaking of, let's talk about the races.
Finally, you accept the inevitable.
The Necrons are probably the most unique race so far, as they don't operate by the usual rules. The big shake-up with them is they don't use requisition, only power. So you go all in on building generators that increment in cost rather than having a fixed price. So what about strategic points? Is there even any reason to capture them? Yes, actually. Not only to deny your enemy them, but they also speed up your production when building obelisks on them, Necron's version of listening posts. Another big unique factor for the Necrons is their monolith, which acts as their HQ, the only building of unit production, and simultaneously their relic unit once upgraded. One of the strongest in the game, as it's not only a monolith, it still retains the ability to produce units while on the move. It can even teleport across terrain and also has an emergency one back to base if it becomes too damaged, avoiding the game over if you got reckless and haven't built a backup monolith. The rest of the roster is pretty much what you'd expect, a very slow tide of death that you creep towards your enemy. One downside to the Necron roster is they really don't have much in the vehicle department, unfortunately. I only tend to use the heavy destroyer to focus down vehicles and buildings. You do have a special unit that can capture enemy vehicles to offset their deficiency here, but they're much more of an infantry focused faction, with heavy shock troopers for every scenario. Not only are their infantry some of the strongest in the game, they even have the ability to sometimes self-revive, quite literally an undying race. The last thing I want to cover for the Necrons is their commander, the Necron Lord, who is a fair bit different to the other commanders. The Necron Lord can be equipped with up to 3 artifacts from the Forbidden Archive building, each granting him an ability that lasts until the end of a game, so effectively a loadout you can make up during a match. I'm not going to go through each one, but I will highlight the Resurrection Orb, which is probably one of the most busted abilities in the game, because it allows you to resurrect any and all dead Necron infantry in an area, even allowing you to exceed your population cap, although I'm sure DE nerfed this. It's even more busted in campaign, since you can use this in combination with your Honor Guard, who remember don't consume population cap, so you can exploit this by getting multiple of one Honor Guard. There is one caveat to the Necron Lord, and that is his death, or more specifically his revival. Unlike other races whose commander respawns where you trained them, the Necron Lord will revive where he last died, which can cause problems if you're not careful. That does it for the Necrons, one of my favourite races alongside the Imperial Guard, a close second or a joint first. I love the whole slow unstoppable tide of death playstyle that the Necrons have, along with how differently they play compared to the other races. Definitely not for new players, as they can be a little rigid and unforgiving if you play them wrong. Let's move on to the Tau.
Eat plasma fire!
There are two halves to the Tau Empire, the Tau, who deal in the range side, and their allies, Recruit and Vespin, who cover the melee side of the roster. They overall definitely lean towards being a ranged faction, with the melee units being used to tie up the enemy for your firing line. The Tau Empire are much more in line with the regular factions, making them easier to get to grips with for newbies when compared to the more complicated Necrons. I describe the Tau as a mid-max faction where their units have tunnel vision for their purpose, so your ranged infantry are great at shooting, but completely shit in a brawl, and vice versa for the melee infantry. Basically all your units have a very strict role, unlike the spacemarines for example, who can be multi-purpose. They also come with an interesting quirk where many of their units have a firing range beyond their vision, so scouts and pathfinders are an important part of the Tau army to make use of the range advantage you have, especially after upgrades which allows the Tau to fire from ridiculous distances. This is offset by, yes, the ranged unit's poor melee, but also by the low health. The Tau infantry are fairly squishy. They also have a more interesting vehicle selection compared to the Necrons: a missile gunship, drone harbinger, the hammerhead gunship, and the obligatory transport vehicle. I could be missing something here, but does anyone actually use these? Anyway, unlike other factions' vehicles that can tank a decent amount of damage, the Tau's convoy are more glass cannons, so you have a few crude monsters to take some heat off. There is one more interesting mechanic with the Tau, and that's a choice you have for the late game. You have the option of building one or two command posts, the Monskar or the Kalyon, with each offering their own late game units and upgrades. I like the idea, but I'm iffy on the execution. Either option seems like it doesn't offer enough and ends up feeling like I got a restricted roster, rather than two fully fledged paths I could choose, or maybe I'm just greedy wanting both the mechs and the insane upgrades you can get. So yeah, that's the Tau Empire. I do enjoy playing this faction. They feel similar to the Eldar in a lot of ways, being a squishy glass cannon, although a bit more durable. But while the Eldar have access to the webway, giving them tons of mobility, the Tau lean more into just dishing out damage, making them more approachable than the Eldar. So that does it for the new factions Dark Crusade offers, but the game also brought some more stuff to the table, some welcome and some not so much. The welcome additions are the new units. I'm not going to cover each one, but I'll highlight my favourite, the heavy weapons team for the Imperial Guard, who have the ability to set up a fortification with a choice of specialised weapons to gun down your opponents. These guys give the Guard the more defensive options that I wanted from Winter Assault, while also having flexibility, with them being able to pack up their gear and set up again at another location. They're kind of a genius unit, upping the Guard's defensive options, but not having the rigidness of a typical defensive structure which would encourage turtling up. A fantastic addition. So let's talk about an unwelcome change that came with Dark Crusade, being the unit limits. Unit limits became more common in Winter Assault, with them limiting the amount of builders you can have, since they removed the population cap on them, and only allowing one relic unit, which I think was fair. It was a bit silly in base game how you could spam land raiders. But Dark Crusade tightens up the limits even more, with them restricting most of your late game roster to only allowing you to have a few of these units. Terminators, only one each. Your backbone tanks, only 2. Warp Spider squads, only allowed 3. The fucking Kassakan squad, you're only allowed 1. I understand it's for balancing, but this is getting to no fun allowed territory. If they really don't want you spamming these units, then just up the population cost on them. So I think that does it for Dark Crusade. The campaign is not to my taste, lacking a bit in the mechanics department on the world map, and the battles being a slog. But the two factions they added are amazing. The Necrons being one of my favourites in the series, and the Tau not too far behind, with them both being unique and offering a lot to Dawn of War. I still recommend to play it despite my critiques. Maybe the sandbox campaign is more up your alley, but now let's dig into Soulstorm. So Soulstorm's campaign is in the same vein as Dark Crusade, a non-linear sandbox that you can play through with all factions, 9 in total now, with the addition of the Sisters of Battle and Dark Eldar. Instead of taking place on a singular planet, Soulstorm's campaign has you fight across a Caravar system which consists of 4 planets and 3 moons, which sounds like it would offer a much more in-depth and expansive world map when compared to Dark Crusade. No, it doesn't. Putting it bluntly, Soulstorm's campaign is a worse version of Dark Crusade's. Despite the additional planets and moons, it barely offers more in terms of scale, as Soulstorm offers 31 territories versus Dark Crusade's 25. It's a very slight downgrade in terms of the faction to territory ratio, but now add on webway gates, the way of travel between planets and moons, and how everything feels even more cramped. Also, why would any non-Eldar faction be using webways? Speaking of feeling cramped, the presentation on the world map really does not help things with its abysmal use of real estate. There's so much dead space here that it simultaneously looks bare and empty, even worse in DE since it added widescreen support that only adds more empty space, but also being hard to read with too much information crowded in one place, even omitting the character models for markers to try and remedy the issue. The 2 back planets are particularly egregious. Caravana 2 looks like a mess with the defense numbers being barely readable and all these lines are all over the place. And Caravana 1 is just hard to see sat in the back, like a shifty kid sat at the back of a classroom. And for whatever bloody reason, the two factions that start there have very similar colours, making it hard to read at a glance. There's a similar problem on Caravana 4 with the Chaos and Dark Eldar, although less egregious. But both of these problems could have easily been fixed. Swap the Imperial Guard and Chaos. Not only would it fix the colour problem, but it also would have been better matchups, with the Sisters of Battle fighting the Heretics, and the Imperial Guard fighting off the Dark Eldar slavers. The narrative has a similar setup to Dark Crusade. I'm just going to quickfire the reasons the factions are here. The Imperial Guard were already here since it's an Imperial system. The Orcs were also already here because Orcs. Also Gorgots turns up again. The Necrons have awoken from their tombs on Caravana 3. Eldar show up to fight the Necrons, not Taldir this time, implying she died on Cronus. Chaos show up because Chaos. Tal show up to expand their empire. Space Marines show up to kill all the Xenos and Heretics. Dark Eldar wants to raid the planets for loot and souls, and probably slaves. And finally the Sisters of Battle show up to kill everyone. And yes, the Imperials are fighting each other again. Having one swappable Imperial faction really would have been good here. So yeah, contrived reason to get all the factions scrapping across the system. I do wonder if they could have approached the campaign from a different angle. Of course I would prefer the more structured narrative campaign, but how about a series of mini campaigns taking place on each planet, in which when you conquer one planet, you move on to the next with their own factions, and maybe even special effects per planet. With the different starting locations for each faction, they could have their own order they tackle the system, and delved in depth on each planet while still having a meta campaign across the system. Because in its current version, each planet just feels like a province in its scale, rather than conquering a whole planet, which in of itself lacks any kind of reward. Speaking of territory, Soulstorm has stepped back here too, with territory providing a unique campaign buff, now only existing in faction strongholds. This makes all the territory outside of the strongholds generic, only providing resources, and in turn, means no unique missions like you get from Dark Crusade, like the Eris Badlands that granted 2 attacks per turn. Aside from strongholds, the only missions you get are Annihilate and Take on Hold for the Webway Gates, both just regular skirmish game modes. They also removed persistent bases from Soulstorm, meaning when you defend a territory, you have to build up from scratch, making these missions painful since you're completely on the back foot versus their army. I can't believe they've done this. Why remove this mechanic? Speaking of stuff they've removed, you've also lost the interactions between the commanders during Stronghold missions, a massive disappointment. Now maybe you could say having this many factions would be too much to do, but even if that was true, which it may have been, they could at least still had some interactions between the main adversaries, but having no interactions whatsoever is just a letdown. We may have lost the interactions, but we still have some dialogue during the missions and intro for the factions, and oof, they are not great. Infamous for the wrong reasons.
Look, rhinos! Rhinos! Our enemies hide in metal boxes, the cowards! The fools! We should take away their metal boxes.
They come!
They come!
Take our thirst for data! For chaos! For terror! Yes!
They draw near. Let them come.
Commander Boreal, enemy forces in our perimeter.
Where? Space Marines, today the enemy is at our door. We know our duty and we will do it. We fight for our honor as Blood Ravens, as Space Marines, and we fight in the name of the Emperor. And if we die this day, we die in glory. We die heroes' deaths, but we shall not die. No, it is the enemy who will taste death and defeat.
It sounds like an old YouTube poop or that one Half-Life 2 machinima. I really don't know what happened here. It's the same voice actors from the prior entries, but I guess they were given horrendous direction. Yeah, these lines were memed a lot, and I think started that whole shitposting trend of loud, obnoxious Warhammer characters saying stuff in the dumbest way possible. Well, that's all I have for the Soulstorm campaign. It's not great. I'm already not the biggest fan of the sandbox direction they went in, but this is just a step backwards. The positives and highlights of Dark Crusade's version have been watered down or axed completely, along with the missed opportunities that a campaign spanning multiple planets could have offered. so the campaign was off the mark. How about the new factions?
Witchcraft, heresy, and mutation!
The Sisters of Battle are an easy faction to get to grips with, since they lack an in-between of the Space Marines and the Imperial Guard, along with not having too complicated mechanics like the Necrons for example. The Sisters are specialised for fire, great at stripping enemies of their morale and turning chaff infantry to ash, along with the use of melters as anti-armour weapons. They also have an interesting shift when going into the late game, as their roster becomes more melee focused, especially compared to the other Imperial factions, which makes sense when you're up and close already with your walking oven makers. The Repenter squads now make up your front line, along with the Walkers and the Sisters Relic unit, a literal angel of death, making up the tip of your spear to really push into the enemy. They also have Faith, a unique resource to the Sisters of Battle. Faith is generated by building holy icons on listening posts, which start out cheap but increment in cost. You can only have 5 holy icons at once, so you can't overproduce and create yourself a buffer. You do need to think about where to build them and how to protect them. But what does Faith actually do? Well, it allows your heroes and specialists to use powerful abilities. I'm not talking basic stuff that they artificially locked away to push a mechanic. These abilities are incredibly strong, some of the strongest in the game. You can turn your basic sister infantry firing simple bolter rounds into firing holy molten lasers, or summon a group of angel units to throw your enemy into disarray. You also have heals and damaging abilities on top of that as well. And that's the Sisters of Battle, a really enjoyable faction to play, great for both newcomers and returning players. I do wish they leaned more into the whole fire angle, maybe giving the bolters incendiary rounds, but it's a minor nitpick, they're still fun to use. My only other gripe is the size of the roster. I do wish they had 1 or 2 extra units since they feel lacking compared to the old guard. The Space Marines for example, who's had their roster expanded and fleshed out. The Sisters feel a little bit behind but not enough to ruin them. Anyway, let's get on to the Dark Eldar.
Death is my meat, terror my wine.
So now we have the Dark Eldar, the evil counterpart to the regular Eldar. Effectively an alternate version like the Chaos to the Loyalist Space Marines. Just like the regular Eldar and Tau, they're a glass cannon race along with an emphasis on hit and runs, with their units being fast and high damage but able to duck from a fight quickly. They trade the tankier units the other factions have for some sacrificial meat shields, but it's basically the same. I find their playstyle a bit redundant since we already have the Tau and Eldar for glass cannons, but there is one trait the Dark Eldar have that the others don't for the most part, and that's a strong early game rush. Not sure if it's intentional or not, but the Dark Eldar early units are a fair bit stronger than average, so charging out and harassing your enemy as they try and capture territory is a great strategy. Especially in the campaign with your hero and honor guard, you can consistently take out AI bases fairly easily. Something that helps with rushing is the way the Dark Eldar's builders work. Normal builders have to sit and actually build a structure, as the name implies, but these guys only need to plant the warp spire pods and it will finish construction by itself, so you can get away with only 1 builder at the start of a game, saving you precious resources. So is having more than 1 builder kind of useless? Not exactly, because they are used to collect the Dark Eldar's unique resource, which is Soul Essence. Soul Essence can be dropped by dead bodies and can also be produced by your slave chambers, which then can be harvested by your builder units. These can be accrued over time, which allows you to use faction abilities, which range from granting a unit detection for seeing stealth units, stripping armor from enemies, or summoning the name of the game as Soulstorm, which is a controllable AoE which does huge damage to any units in its radius. The Dark Eldar are fine. They're the weakest faction in the series, but not bad considering the standard is so high. I find their playstyle redundant, sandwiched between the Tau and the regular Eldar, along with them suffering from the same smaller roster issue the Sisters of Battle have, making them difficult to stand out. The only thing they have going for them is the early game rushing, which isn't particularly interesting for me. Against the AI it means the match is over quickly with no fun encounters. With other people it's super sweaty, it's really up to you if this is your thing. It seems like a great way to get someone to drop a slur in your DMs. So that does it for the 2 factions. Let's talk about the new big addition that came with Soulstorm, which is air units. They sound more interesting than they actually are. The issue is it feels like a mod added them with how janky and off they feel. They can't go over some terrain and, as ridiculous as this sounds, can even get stuck on the environment they're flying over. There isn't any landing and taking off, momentum or air control, so no interest in dogfighting. The air units are basically just a typical vehicle but floating high off the ground. I'm sure this is pulled from the jump ability some units have. They were awkwardly stapled onto the game to try and sell a feature that frankly hasn't been fleshed out properly. Also, I think Games Workshop were pushing air figurines at the time. Not the best advertisement for them, honestly. I almost never use these aside from a quick recon every now and then, a really weak addition. In addition to the air units being kind of underwhelming, they take the place of the new units that each faction normally gets, so you're not into these janky things like me, then fuck you. You get nothing. Good day, sir. The only exception is the Necrons, who get a new Catan to summon called the Deceiver, in which their Scourge unit has been changed to an air unit to fill the gap in the Necrons roster. Although this is such a downgrade since it can now only be in the air, making them useless for ground targets. Although, the lack of new units seems to be the result of things getting cut, since I came across an old GameFAQs post, going back a bit I know, that showed each faction was supposed to get a new unit based on information out data mined from the Soulstorm demo, but were not present in the final release. I did try and corroborate this claim and found more people saying similar things, but I can't find anything concrete, so take it with a grain of salt. In fact, let's talk a bit about Soulstorm and its release back in 2008, because it had such a rough launch that its ramifications are still being felt here in the Definitive Edition. Aside from the issues I've already mentioned, the original launch had its own plethora of issues. It had balancing problems related to the new factions, game-breaking bugs such as an infinite faith exploit for the Sisters of Battle, and all-round stability issues, something even I remember experiencing. And funnily enough, the one and only crash I had with the Definitive Edition was through the Soulstorm campaign. Along with online being completely fucked, with players being able to use trainers to completely ruin the game, spawning in whatever they want, and could even switch to another player's faction mid-match and destroy all their stuff. And none of this got addressed until 9 months after launch, so the game was dead at that point, since the online base went back to Darkcrusade. The devs, Iron Law Entertainment, were in an unfortunate spot, as the studio was set to shut down with the release of Soulstorm being their final outing, so the morale of the devs weren't exactly high, but they did want to make this game a hit, with it being their final hurrah. Unfortunately, THQ decided to make things as difficult as possible with budget and time cuts throughout development, along with mandating the aforementioned air units that seemingly gutted the other new units the factions were maybe supposed to get. Iron Law then shut down due to being unable to secure funding for their next project, a few days before Soulstorm's launch. Yeah, this is why patching took so long. The responsibility got bounced back to Relic, who were hard at work on Company of Heroes and Dawn of War 2, and they simply didn't have the time, or the patience to work with Spaghetti Code, to give Soulstorm the much needed support. So it got thrown on the back burner until they eventually decided to get it into an acceptable state. What a fucking mess. This is reminding me what happened with Fear, although nowhere near as bad. At least it got there in the end. It turned into a perfectly fine game with 2 new factions, one great and one okay. Although the campaign is really lacking, the same criticisms I had for Dark Crusade apply here, on top of my other critiques. There's no saying with these games, Dark Crusade for the campaign, Soulstorm for the online and mods, and I think that's fair. Even with its disastrous launch and lackluster additions, it became the go-to for the player base, as this is where all the mods and community settled for well over a decade into the Definitive Edition, which is, I think, is where mostly everyone has now moved to. Well, that leads us neatly onto my final thoughts on the Definitive Edition, which I think is a great collection. The games included are all worth playing, even if they do stumble a bit towards the end, and it does a great job of preserving them for the future. There are a few issues I've had since starting this series, so let's finally address them. While the primary sound issues have been patched, the dialogue skipping, there's still the occasion when sound effects stop playing or music cutting out. The patch did help things, but the issue also seems game specific, since I honestly didn't have many problems in these 2 expansions, but had significant issues with Winter Assault. One complaint though, the new music that plays in the missions on Dark Crusade and Soulstorm is really quiet for whatever reason. I'm not sure it's always like that, but it's a shame since it offers remixed tracks during the Stronghold missions that ends up being underappreciated. Also, as a side note, since I didn't talk about the soundtrack, the themes for the Tower and the Sisters of Battle are fantastic. Skirmish has a few issues which I think hampers the longevity of the game. A big one is being unable to change your start location. Even in the game's original releases, this is such a bizarre oversight. Every RTS game I can think of allows you to do this. Why Dawn of War never had this basic feature is beyond me. It also makes online play really finicky, since if you want people in specific spots, you have to join in a certain order, messing around with closing and opening slots to get everyone in the right spawn location. Just a lot of farting around for something very basic, and I really wish DE added in this much needed feature. I also wish DE gave us options to disable what unit caps we want, since Skirmish is based off the Soulstorm version. All the no fun allowed unit caps that got introduced in Dark Crusade and continued in Soulstorm apply here, so no tank columns or multiple Kassakan squads. Speaking of Soulstorm Skirmish, it'd be nice to have the option to play the other game's Skirmish versions with the old gameplay and without the added units. This may seem like a big ask and maybe a bit niche, since everyone gravitates to whether entry has the most content, but if you've got the campaigns running off the old versions, the Skirmish has to be there too, and I know that's true for Dark Crusade. The AI on the same difficulty is seriously inconsistent between the factions. The Dark Eldar are an absolute cakewalk with a borderline broken AI. The Imperial Guard and Necrons take too long to get going, so can be dealt with easily if you don't dawdle, while the 4 base game factions feel like they're actually appropriate for the difficulty. I know balancing the AI difficulty evenly amongst the races isn't easy, but there are massive gaps in their competency. The Dark Eldar on hard are around the same as the Space Marines on normal. Finally, Steam Workshop support would be great. I know I've already mentioned this before, but it would make modding so much easier. I've heard it's not possible because of file size limits, which I don't think is true when you look at mods for other games, but even then, if it's only supported for maps, I'd be happy with that. And I know it's possible since Company of Heroes 1 has Steam Workshop support, and it's the same engine. So I think that's everything, at least with Dawn of War 1. It's an amazing set of games that I think achieved most of its potential in the confines of the base game and expansion packs. I know some people wanted more, especially with the direction the sequels went, but I don't have that feeling of wondering what it could have been like I do with, let's say, the Fear franchise. Aside the potential of continuing with more structured narrative campaigns, I think Dawn of War 1 ran its course in a mostly graceful manner. Base game brought a fresh new RTS to the table, Winds of Assault refined it and expanded it, Dark Crusade experimented and expanded it some more, and Soulstorm also expanded it but with some baggage. If you want even more expansions, you have mod support adding tons of content, and some of these projects have been worked on for over a decade, so there's plenty to sink your teeth into. And with the opened up engine support that came with the Definitive Edition, there may be much more on the way. So yeah, it's an easy recommendation for the Definitive Edition. It comes with 4 campaigns, 2 narrative and 2 sandbox, 9 races in total, and over 100 skirmish maps to play on. For the price it's a no-brainer, and even then it goes on sale if you're still on the fence. If I wanted to be really nitpicky, I wish DE would give you the original releases too, just so it's a one-stop purchase for everything and cover any cases with mod compatibility. Next we'll be looking at a sequel that takes things in a different direction again. That's all for now, I'll see you again.